Today we'll discuss the world's second most famous Adams family, after these guys, of course. This Adams family. The Adamses are a political dynasty like the Kennedys or Roosevelts. I found this tree online and added John and Abigail at the top. They make it 7 generations. I don't know the religions of everyone in this tree, but they are all Adamses or Adams in-laws, and it's a pruned tree, so they are mostly political. John Adams was born 12 miles south of Boston, the son of a Puritan farmer/shoemaker. His father sent him to Harvard to become a minister, but John chose the law. Like many Massachusetts of his generation, he converted to Unitarianism, joining at age 37. I like John for his fair-mindedness. In 1765, he opposed the Stamp Act, which triggered protests against Britain, but in 1770, 9 British soldiers were arrested for firing into a Boston crowd and killing 5 civilians in the sensational Boston Massacre, and John was the only lawyer who would defend them. By his defense, most of the soldiers were acquitted. 2 were convicted as first-time offenders. They used a strange British law called benefit of clergy to avoid the death penalty. They were branded on their thumbs with the letter M for murderer. John was a founding father, and a big one. He introduced the resolution that the colonies form new governments. He asked Thomas Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence. He nominated George Washington as commander-in-chief. Later in life, he appointed John Marshall to the Supreme Court. Marshall is credited with keeping the Supreme Court equal in power to the presidency and Congress, and given the many times that the court has upheld progressive interpretations of the law, I'm glad that he did. John ran for president in the first U.S. election, but came second to George Washington. By the rules at the time, that made him vice president. Despite casting 29 tie-breaking votes in the Senate, a record that still stands today, he said of his job, "My country has, in its wisdom, contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived." John got his chance as second President of the United States from 1796 to 1800. The musical Hamilton paints his administration as unimpressive, perhaps because Hamilton was not a supporter. John continued most of Washington's policies. He started the U.S. Navy, for which the Naval Reserve Center in Quincy, Massachusetts, lays a wreath at his grave every October 30th. He kept the U.S. out of a war with revolutionary France when his cabinet and the voters wanted one. John lived to age 90. By an amazing coincidence, he died on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. His last words were, "Thomas Jefferson still survives." But by an even more amazing coincidence, he was wrong. Hundreds of miles away, his good friend Jefferson had died 4 hours before him. Abigail Smith came from money. Her mother was a Quincy of the Puritan aristocracy. Abigail became John Adams's wife when she was 19 and he was 30. In her 40s and 50s, she was the first second lady and the second first lady. Third base, I don't know. Abigail was homeschooled in an upper-class home with a large library and had the brains to benefit from it. She was a strong feminist, advocating for property rights for wives and warning the Continental Congress that women would not obey misogynistic laws. She had the ear of her husband in most things, but not in that. He replied, "We have only the name of masters, and rather than give up this, which would completely subject us to the despotism of the petticoat, I hope General Washington and all our brave heroes would fight." John consulted her on politics and affairs of state throughout their lives. In the 70s and 80s, their letters are one of our best sources for the workings of the Continental Congress. From 1784 to 88, she was John's companion on diplomatic missions to Paris and London. Their opponents referred to her as Mrs. President. John and Abigail Adams had 6 children. 2 died in infancy, as happened so often until recently. 2 were lost as adults to alcoholism and despair and depression. 1 had a normal life as a wife and mother. The other was John Quincy Adams, 6th President of the United States. Quincy, as I'd better call him, traveled with his diplomat father as a child. It was probably the European connection that made him want a coat of arms late in life. The top left is a seal his father invented to commemorate what he called his greatest achievement, getting the British to agree that the U.S. went beyond the 13 colonies to the Mississippi River. Top right is the Smiths from his mother Abigail. Bottom are the Quincys and Boylstons from his 2 grandmothers. His father had used the Boylston arms as his seal on official documents, adding lions and fleur-de-lis inside black circles to commemorate his diplomatic service. Young Quincy visited Spain, France, Russia, England, and Holland during America's Revolutionary War. He started a diary for the trip and kept it for 71 years. These ships are horrid and frightful. I'm not insulting his drawing, that's their names. Quincy's diaries are a great source of information about his life and times, and he knew it. As an old man, he said they were second in importance only to the Bible, which is probably going a bit far. After the war, at age 18, Quincy went back to America and enrolled at Harvard. He became a successful lawyer. In 1794, age 27, George Washington appointed him ambassador to the Netherlands and then to Portugal. When his father became president, he made him ambassador to Prussia. Quincy negotiated a treaty of amity and commerce with the Prussian prime minister, and I'm overjoyed to tell you that his name was Karl Wilhelm Fink von Finkenstein. While wintering in London, Quincy fell in love and married Louisa Johnson. He had in-law troubles. Specifically, his father-in-law went bankrupt before paying the dowry and fled to America and went insane. But Quincy never regretted the marriage. When he became president in 1825, Louisa became the first foreign-born First Lady. Do you know the second? Well, it's Melania Trump. When Jefferson replaced John Adams as president, Quincy came home, age 35, and successfully ran for the Senate. He served 8 years. In 1812, he became America's first ambassador to Russia. He and his family were there when Napoleon invaded. His wife and youngest son had to flee from Moscow. Quincy is one of America's all-time top diplomats. He negotiated several treaties, including the Treaty of Ghent to end the War of 1812. He was Secretary of State when they made the 49th parallel, the western part of the border with Canada. He negotiated the U.S. border with Mexico and the purchase of Florida from Spain. He masterminded the Monroe Doctrine. Adams and Monroe told Europe to stay out of the Americas or else. In 1823, that was pure bluff, but it worked. Quincy was a special kind of party man, by which I mean he tried them all. He was in the Federalist, Democratic Republican, National Republican, Anti-Masonic, and Whig parties. In practice, that meant that he thought for himself and supported what he believed, even when that meant a new party. He was the 6th president from 1825 to 29. He took the oath of office with his hand on not the Bible, but a book of constitutional law. And he is the only president to own a pet alligator. As to policies, he set high import tariffs, which helped develop U.S. infrastructure and ramp up the U.S. economy, enabling him to pay off most of the national debt. He was fair and generous to indigenous Americans, a policy definitely not continued by his successor. Quincy lost the next election to Andrew Jackson. Instead of retiring, he spent many years as a Massachusetts congressman. He advocated against slavery and for science. He was instrumental in setting up the Smithsonian Institute and the United States Naval Observatory. In all, I approve of how both Adamses did their jobs. They always preferred peace to war, they supported education and economic development, and they pushed for as much social justice as you could expect in their time and place. I'd say the same thing about the other Unitarian presidents, Fillmore and Taft, but their names don't begin with A, so I'll move on. Quincy's sons, George and John, the second, also went to Harvard. In fact, Adamses still go there. Sorry to say, George and John are in the show for their tragic and scandalous fates. When Quincy went to Moscow in 1812, the brothers were left behind with the grandparents. 5 years later, Quincy came home and declared himself displeased with the two teenagers. From then on, they were harshly disciplined and rebellious, and heavy drinkers into the bargain. Their mother's niece, Mary Helen, was orphaned at age 9. She came to live in Washington with Quincy and Louisa. The Quincy brand of discipline didn't do a thing for Mary either. She was beautiful and flirtatious. Step 1. As a teenager, she bedded the youngest brother, Charles. Step 2. She became engaged to George. The couple agreed to wait until George was established as a lawyer. Step 3. At age 20, John participated in a student strike at Harvard and got expelled. John came home from Washington while he came home to Washington while George was lawyering in Massachusetts. Mary transferred her attentions to John. It was John that Mary married in 1828. Quincy was still president, and the wedding was at the White House. George and Charles both declined their invitations. George had been suffering from depression for some time. His career was a failure, his love life a shambles. When Quincy called him back to Washington, George boarded a steamship. He went over the railing en route, an apparent suicide. John's story is no better. He was his father's secretary at the White House. An anti-Adams reporter tried to start a duel with him in the rotunda, pulling his nose and slapping him. When John wouldn't fight, the anti-Adams press branded him a coward and dragged his name through the press. That accelerated his drinking. After marriage, he had 2 daughters, whom Quincy doted on. That was John's only success. He failed at lawyering and at running a flour mill, and he drank himself to death by age 31. Mary atoned by living with her in-laws for the rest of their lives and caring for them in their old age. Fortunately for the Adams legacy, there was a third son, Charles. Don't let his cheerful expression fool you. He turns out fine. Charles was an American historian, politician, and diplomat. As an historian, he concentrated on John and Abigail Adams, and wow, did he have source materials. As a politician, he was a state senator in Massachusetts for 2 terms and ran for vice president in 1848 with the quixotic Free Soil Party. As a diplomat, he served under Abraham Lincoln as minister to the United Kingdom, persuading them not to recognize the Confederate States as independent.